Okay, so we've proven we can animate the controls now using effectively a timer and calculating the size. And we want to start to move this now into more of a controllable control, in essence. So we want to break out things like the fixed time, for example here, the 1 second animation we have it at. We want that to become a direct property. We also don't want to just animate randomly. We want to bind that to an open or a close or potentially a toggle button. And we want to support both forward and backwards animation. So let's just review the code first and find out what we're going to keep and make sure it's documented well. So we've got the desired size that stores the desired size of the control, which is fine. We have a flag for if we're currently animating, which is a useful flag that we need, so we'll keep that. We have the animation timer that runs on the UI thread when it calls back, which is what we want and what we'll need. And we have the current position in the animation, which is also needed. And then there's going to be a few more things we want to now break out from the constructor, so it's just easier to see. The frame rate will move out, and we'll just make that a private member. We'll want to move out the total ticks, which will be a calculation. So instead of it being here, we can move it as a fixed property. So we'll just make that a getter because it never needs to be set, it's calculated. The animation time now we want to make an actual settable direct property. So this can become animation time once we set this. So we'll do a new region here for public properties. We'll do a new direct property and it will be called animation time, and that's the time it takes for the animation to complete, which will be a time span. And then we'll rename this fixed property here to the name of the actual animation time. I'm just going to group these in another region each time because there's 3 values for a direct property, which is kind of annoying, and I'd probably like to find a way to obfuscate this into a single value instead of having to do all this every time we want one property. So for now I'm just going to wrap it in another region so that we can just collapse it down. So we now have animation time. We'll want to set the default. So we'll just set it to time span from seconds. And for now, just for the slow visual we want to check, we'll leave it at 3. And then we'll change this to 0.3 as default afterwards. So we have the animation time. This will now find that value we just set. And total ticks becomes a calculated value. We'll probably want a public property as well for when the controller is open or closed. That's just an indication that can't be set. It's literally asking, is it open or is it closed? And we can request to open or request to close. So we'll have a public boolean is opened, and that can be a calculated property again of the animation current ticks, whether it's greater than or equal to the total ticks. So indicates if the control is currently opened. Then because we will be controlling the open and closed with probably, let's just chuck them in for now, public commands. And we'll expand this and probably do whatever we need to afterwards, but for now we'll just have open. And that will be a relay command. And public close is also a relay command. And all we'll do for that is set a private property as to whether we want to be open or closed, and by default will be closed. Sets whether the control should be opening or closing. And because we will have a stage where we're opening and closing, as well as animating, so now we can just set when we go to open, as simple as set the desired flag to be open. And when you're closing, set the desired flag to be false. And then in our new loop, we can check this and do the right thing. So if we go to the constructor now, let's see what else we can remove. The creation of the timer can stay there, that's fine. We don't really care about that. Reset the ticks, that's not really needed because in the constructor by default this is already 0, so it's just a nonsensical call for the constructor. The tick now, this wants to be removed from the constructor here, and this turned into an actual function. So let's just take the whole set of the tick timer for now, and let's set that to an actual method on this class. So we'll call that animation tick. And in fact, just so we don't have to pass random unused variables in, we'll just do that. And now we can have a region for private methods, private void animation tick. Paste the original code in, remove the braces, reformat, and just update the variables to match the new ones. So that's partly moved and cleaned. Why is that complaining? Oh, because we have to actually pass the sender and event args into that bit that we're not using. Right, so constructor is done. We can close that. Private properties for now is done. Public properties for now is done. Public commands for now is done. So we really want to focus on making this tick timer enable and disable when we need to animate. But the first thing I think we need to tackle is the fact that at the minute we're using this when we're not animating, grab a desired size, reset the animation, start the animation. None of this is really relevant for what we're trying to do now. So let's just delete all that and rethink about how we're going to do this. So we know we need to set the desired size to the desired size minus the margin. We know that. But at the moment, what we need to do is figure out when we have finished calculating the size. We saw that by default it showed up twice. It kind of calculated once, then come back and calculated with another margin. And then once that's done, it's just done. There's no real way for us to know when the last render call has been called. So there might be some way to kind of flag, but I don't think there is, when simply the UI has shown it's calculated the position of this current menu and we have the final size. Because what if you change the screen resolution? What if you change the control size by dragging and resizing? That's going to change the size. So the only real way we can determine the final size is that right now just making a presumption to let the control come into view, set up as it is, and size the way it wants. And then we're just going to have to set like a timeout. So once we stop getting render events fired for, say, 1/5 of a second, we'll presume that's the expected automatic size. And this is probably the reason that the other controls, the native controls, don't support the natural expected width and height of a control, because it's always changing and always variable. But we can do what we need to do, and that is to use the expected default size when it first opens. So what we will want to do is set another private member, and we'll just chuck another property in here, and we'll keep track of if size is found. So we'll just put size found. Keeps track of if we have found the desired 100% width, height, auto size. So we're going to make that presumption, as I said, with like a timer. So we'll need another timer as well. So below the animation time, we'll just do another timer. This time, we don't want it to be a continuing running timer. We want it to time out. So this one is just literally going to be a system.timer.timer. And we'll call this one sizing timer. The timeout timer to detect when auto sizing has finished firing. We'll go back in the constructor to set this, and we will set the sizing timer to a new timer, and then it's going to expect a callback once it's finished running. So we'll just set that directly inside of here for how small it's going to be. Or have I got the wrong timer? Actually, I think, is it a threading timer? Let's try the threading timer. There we go, it's a threading timer, not a system.timer. So just make sure to use the system.threading.timer, that's the one we want. And then this callback will happen when it times out, in essence. And you'll see that how we sort of reset that in a moment. So this will fire. What we want to do is reset this timer every time render's called. So by default, when you create it, nothing's going to fire. But once we change the interval and say, right, after say 200 milliseconds, fire, if we keep resetting that interval before the 200 milliseconds runs out, this will never fire. So once we're in here, we finally stopped receiving render calls. And when that happens, what do we want to do? So firstly, if we have already calculated the size, because this is going to fire now every time that the control resizes. And for now, we just want to take the initial size that appears. So if we've already set the size found flag, we're just going to ignore for now. No longer accept new sizes. And we can tweak this as we go, depending on our needs. As soon as that's stopped now, we set the size found to true. So this is kind of a set once and forget kind of call. And then after that, we now need to set the desired size, which was desired size equals desired size minus margin. And the only thing to watch out for here is this is a UI threaded property. So if we're not on the UI thread, this is going to complain. And we're in a generic threaded timer. So right now in here, this is not going to run on the UI thread. So let's just break out to the UI thread, similar to WPF. You'll have a dispatcher, and you can have the UI thread, and you can just invoke on the UI thread. And that's all we care about for now. Jump onto the UI thread, set the desired size, and that's no different than before. And now here we would want to start the animation in a sense, or tell the animation to update, like something has changed. So instead of just starting this tick for it to do things, I think we also need a kind of intermediate gap where we just say, right, something's changed. The user's maybe selected to open the menu or close the menu, or we found the size, and it needs to recalculate what it should do. And for now, that is probably just going to be restart this timer. But let's break out that logic into a different call so that we have more control on if we wanted to set variables or change things when something about the animation resets. So we'll just say update animation, and we'll call the method update animation. And then in our private methods, we'll just do update animation, and we will do just the animation timer start, just like we did before. And the only thing we're going to add in here extra for now is once we do, say, this command open, we want to update as well. So update animation, otherwise the non-running thread for the animation will never run. So we'll just simply say update animation once we've changed that variable. And we'll handle then the loop of the ticks to handle what this is currently doing. But what could happen here, say we start up the control and we're still sizing the control, and I know it doesn't take long, but there's still a finite amount of time there. And what if the user clicked the open command and then it starts to update the timer? The timer would then start, it would run into this tick, and it would start trying to animate. But we don't currently have a desired size. So this would be 0, and we would animate to 0, and we would set the control to 0. And then when the render recalls, and we've still not got the size yet, the new size is going to end up being 0, and you'll never end up with an actual size. So the one thing we'll do in the update animation method is simply do nothing if we still haven't found our initial size. And this will change, or maybe this logic won't change, but say we want to set a control size manually with some styled properties instead of it defaulting to 100% width and height in the future. If those properties were set, we could update this command to say if size found or, expected width or expected height values are set, then you could, ignore this. But again, for now, we're just going to make our control work for our exact needs, and it can be expanded on in the future. So we're not going to overthink it and engineer this to be an all-encompassing generic control right now. We're going to make it work for us in our situation and let it naturally evolve as we have requirements for the control. So we're just going to tell it to start the animation thread again. And that will mean now, as soon as size is found, when the size does get found, we then call update animation, and bear in mind we've set the size to true. It will come into here again, and then it will simply start the timer again, and we'll finally then run this command only once we've found the size of the control. So if we ran this at the moment, this control just simply expands. This automatically doesn't expand. So what we should find is this should still work, but the control will expand as soon as the size is found, and if the size works. So let's just put some breakpoints in and test where we're up to. And oh yeah, and obviously in render we actually need to put the code back now to set that timer I mentioned. So all we want to do is every time the size changes, and if we don't currently have the size, so remember, once we've found the size, we're no longer going to do this. So if we have not yet found the desired size, so if not, we then want to simply start off initially. The first call will start off this sizing timer. So if we put a breakpoint in here, and we were to run this right now, let's just do this, say, you should find that this you'll get called into here obviously, but you'll never get called into, there you go, get called into here twice, but you never get called into this thread because we've never set it. So in order to set that, what we do is just get the sizing timer and just call change. And what we're going to do is change the interval at which we expect it to count down and then start. And the way we do that is to simply set a due time, so it's due in 200 milliseconds, and we don't care about a period, so we'll just set that to a max value. So by doing this, what we're saying is every time we hit render, start off counting down the timer, and if this doesn't get called again within 200 milliseconds, then we're going to end up in our callback. So let's just slow that down initially to see this happening and make it 2 seconds and run this code. We'll put a breakpoint there. So here now we're going to set the timer running, and if we don't do anything for 2 seconds, we're going to get in that callback. You can see then the render call is called back in again for a second time, which we expected. And we're going to call this change again, which means the timer now that's currently counting down, and you can see there it's due in 2 seconds. When we call this again, it's going to reset that, so it's going to have to wait a further 2 seconds. And if we continue to just call this in a loop, before 2 seconds was up, this would never then break back into our callback. But as soon as this stops being hit, like now, in 2 seconds, we now hit into our timer. So you can see what that's doing. It's basically think if you were typing something to the keyboard and you wanted to automatically search. And every time you're tapping keys on the keyboard, you don't want it to search instantly on keyboard taps. You want a timeout, so when the user stops typing for a brief amount of time, you start a search again. That kind of reset every time they press a button on the keyboard, but as soon as they stop typing for 200 milliseconds, you start a search. That's the kind of functionality we've just done. But in this case, we've simply used the render command, so every time the size is being changed, we reset that timer, and then eventually, once the size has now been found, we can set it to be found, and we will actually get the desired size now, which is the one we expect. And you can see we've now got the desired size. We then call update animation. So if we go into our update animation call, which currently is just going to say, if not size found, then return. We then would start the animation. So let's just restart that. Now we've fixed that bug there in the update animation. So we hit that twice, which we know works. 2 seconds later, we're going to hit this, and we're going to start the animation tick. We're going to get into here. So we know all that's working. And now we're going to start the animation. So we start at 2 in this case, we get the percentage animated, we get the final width and height being set, and this will now fire back every time the size is changing, but because we have found the size already, it's not going to fire off another event, which is what we want. So what we should find is if we take all the breakpoints off now, we'll start the application, it will appear fully sized, and then 2 seconds later it's just going to start at 0 and expand back out for 3 seconds. So it's fully sized, and then it should just disappear and start animating in. So that's in slow motion what we want to do. So now what we can do is speed this up to say 200 milliseconds, because it should have sized and settled down well within less than 200 milliseconds. But you can see the slight issue we have here is when we start up, you can see the control, because it needs to be there in order to find out the exact size, and then it expands. So ignore the fact that it's expanding for now, but let's fix that visual glitch. So how do we go about allowing this control to size, and then once it's finished sizing, only then show it if it's currently meant to be open or not? Because you could also have the command set for open, so you might want to default to open, which is another thing we might want, as well as a command for open and a command for close. We probably want to expand this variable behind from just being a boolean and make that a direct property so that we could bind to it. So let's just cut the property there, and let's just make a new one here. And we should comment one of these, so I reckon we will comment the actual open. Property to set whether the control should be open or closed. So that's that. Now we just need to update these. We can't call this one open because we have a property called open. So we should call it, I guess, begin open and begin close. So we can bind to those properties, and this can set the open to true or the open to false. So now we have 3 ways of doing this. We can request it to be open and closed on a button click, or we can bind the property open to default the control whether it wants to start in an open or closed state, if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, it will when we start using this. So back to what we were originally about to do, or about to try. We now have this set up, which is correct. And the dilemma we had is, what if this was meant to be closed to begin with, but we need to calculate the size? That's the issue we'll have. Because you're going to see this control momentarily when the window appears, and then it's going to do whatever it needs to do. So we don't want to see that glitch. Well, there's a simple fix for that as well. We just make another private property, and this wants to be a float, and we'll just call this original opacity. And we're going to use a little trick here. Store the control's original opacity value at startup. And this is something we'll possibly have to change and tweak once we find out we adjust the opacity. But what we're going to do for now is in the constructor, just simply set the original opacity equals whatever opacity we get at this point in time. And opacity is a double. So change that to a double. But yeah, what we might find is in this constructor here, this opacity might get set at a different point when we come to bind the control's opacity to a different value. But for now, we're not doing that, so we're going to expect that this is the value we want. And if we come across a bug, we'll fix it when we get that issue. So again, not overthinking this, making the control work for us. And then as we find issues, we'll code that into the control to work exactly as we want. So remember original control's opacity, and now set it to 0. And then once we've finished animating, we need to reset that opacity. So to do that, we also need to fix the animation tick to now actually support listening to those new properties we've made. So let's just comment this first. Calculate and start any new required animations. That's that one done. The update controls sizes based on the next tick of an animation. And I think the constructor's all done. Yep, so the only thing now is to fix this loop. And because we need to change the opacity, we're going to need yet another control, or another private member rather. Private boolean, and we want to know if this is the first animation or not. Because if it's the first animation, like the first time we actually need to animate either open or close, just before we start that, we need to reset the opacity, if that makes sense. And that will default to true. Indicates if this is the first time we are animating. And then if we go into the animation tick now, the very first check we want to do, and remember this tick won't happen until we have the size because of this check. So the first time we start will literally be once the control size has been calculated. That will always be the first thing that will happen. So this first tick will always come from once the control's created and the size is worked out. So if this is the first call after calculating the desired size, so if first animation, we want to now clear that flag. Clear the flag so it doesn't run twice. We could technically lock this if we were really concerned, but this is a tick 60 times a second. It's not infinitely quick. So the likelihood of hitting a double run between here and having a lock is next to nothing. So I'm not going to worry about that for now. And if this is the first time we're animating, then I guess, or rather, if this is the first state, so say we've bound the public property open to say be open or closed, I don't think we want to initially animate that. So if we were to open this control and by default it was set to closed, you don't want to start up the control and see it animate from open to closed. That makes no sense. And the same as if we were setting it to open when you first run the application, I'd expect to see that menu simply visible, not animate in. So on the very first animation, let's bypass all of the animation. So bypass all animation and set size. So for that, the width will be, and bear in mind now we have the, is it the open? Yep. We have the open property, which is the thing that will be set. And if that is open, we want it to be the desired size. And if it wants to be closed, it's simply 0. We'll do the same for height. If it's open, it wants to be the height, and if it's closed, it wants to be 0. We also want to now set the opacity back to the original opacity. And we're done on this first tick. So if we did that right now, this should all run. It should, if we do this 2-second delay, we should see it show, but not be visible because we've set the opacity to 0. So we should just simply open the control, not see anything. 2 seconds later, we'll check if this runs. And at the moment, because open will be defaulted to closed, we're not going to see it. So I'm just going to default this for the moment to open. So we should see it not be there for 2 seconds, which is correct, you can't see it. Once this runs, we want to be open, so we should set it to the desired size. And when I finish running this, we should see the control, which you can now see. So if we take the breakpoint off and do that again, we should basically see that the control is invisible for 2 seconds and then takes on its default size. Oh, and then something's gone wrong and it started animating. So let's just figure out what that was. And I know what that is. It's because the tick will continue to run now we've started it. So let's just return from here for the moment till we fix that. And there we go. So you see it simply not be there and then be visible. Change this back now to 200 milliseconds. And you can see the control simply appears as if it was there. You could probably tweak this, and I bet you any money you could probably do 100 or 10 or 50. And that will make the control appear by default much quicker when the application opens. So I'd say stick at 100 for now, that seems to work for us. And all we need to do here is now fix the rest of this animation tick. So we know the first one now works. We know we've calculated the size and we get the first one. I'm going to reset the open to be false again, because I think that's the expected behavior of an animation in control. An animated pop-up you wouldn't expect to be visible by default. So after the first animation set, we will always default to the final size, and we will want to calculate when we've finished. So at the minute we calculate this way. We start by adding a tick, which we don't want to do just yet because we're not necessarily going to be adding the tick. Instead, we set that we're animating, which again I actually think is probably too soon. I think that wants to be after this check, otherwise it'll constantly come in and go animating when it's not. So we'll do that animation set after this. So how do we update this check to know when we've finished animating? Well, if we're animating open, this is already valid check. If we're animating closed, it's simply if the ticks is 0. So we just need to update this flag. If we have reached the end of our animation. And that will be 2 checks. One is if we are to be open and the ticks is greater than the total ticks. I think that'll be greater than or equal to, because this will come in, we'll do the check first and we'll add afterwards. So that'll be greater than or equal to the ticks. Or if we're not open and the animation current tick is 0. So by default we are closed and the ticks are 0. So as soon as we start the control in this current state, we should hit this, that is the end of an animation, which is correct. So the first time it will come in, it will run in here, set up and configure the control, close it for us and make it visible. Then the next tick will appear and we'll hit this logic, in which case we'll now stop the timer, prevent animation and break out. So we'll just get 2 hits and it will never reach here, which is the behavior we want. One thing we want to do once we've finished animating, however, is to set the final size. And that's just because the animation is 60 frames a second. So what if we calculated the percentage as being 99.97 and not 100%? And it could do that with how we are calculating the easing and the percentage. So it might not be absolutely to the pixel the final size. So if we finished animating, let's just make sure the final size is set. We already set it here. So that does mean we could potentially move this into here, because we know this is going to run. We're not stopping the timer running, we're going to let it run again. So it will hit this first, return, and it will always hit this again. So there's no point duplicating that code. So if we put a breakpoint here, we should find we never hit that. We know we hit this once, and we'll check we hit this. So let's just put a breakpoint on each of those. Let's check that we do hit these 2. It should open up, instantly come into here, run the first animation, and then run the second animation. And you should see it set to 0, stops animating. And because we've done this, we shouldn't now hit anything again. We shouldn't even hit into this thread at all. Which we don't, which is right. So far so good. So how are we now going to get to this animating state? Well, we're going to do that by setting the open or close property or running the commands. So we're either going to set the public open property, or we're going to bind to a command on the button and do begin open or begin close. So let's just bind on the main view on the stereo button. Let's bind this to Now this is where we want to bind to the controls property. So if we just hide the visual for now, we can do the CSS selector, and if we do animated pop-up, here we go, the name is channel configuration pop-up. Go back down to the stereo button, and in the command for the button now, if we use a hashtag in the name of the other control, we can bind to the properties on that control. And in this case, we should have a command called begin open. There we go. And I think if we bind like that, and it's a relay command, I think that should work. So there's one way to find out, and that is, I guess, to click in here. So if we run that, everything should just start up and appear normal. And if we click this, yes, we now hit that command. So what we're going to do now is set the open flag to true. We're going to call update animation. Update animation is going to literally just say start the timer again. So now we are going to end up in this animation timer again. As we do that, this is no longer the first animation, so it skips that. We want to open, and the current tick is 0. So therefore, we're going to simply ignore this entire pass, and we're going to hit into the animation phase. The animation phase at the moment, again, just animates outwards. But if we uncheck that, and we start that again without debugging, we should see now when we click the button, it should animate out. And I've removed that check, I thought I did. Let's try it once more so you can see that. And we don't see anything. So let's find out why we don't see anything. So we've got the size, we click it, we should be animating. The percentage is 0, and why is it 0? Because we forgot to re-add the tick. When I moved the tick from up here, I didn't add it back here. So animating, and in order to figure out which way we want to go, move the tick in the right direction. You want to do the, and this is where reversing the animation is super simple, because we calculate on the percentage of where we are as a tick as to what the size is. So all we need to do is literally reverse the direction of this tick. So we'll add to the tick, and if we are opening, we will add 1. And if we're closing, we'll -1. And the only extra thing we want to do here is, actually I don't think we need to check, because we'll always hit here if the animation tick is 0. So this is never going to go into the negative and wrap around. And we'll never go past total ticks because we've got this check here. So this kind of check is going to prevent this plus and -1 from ever wrapping the integer negatively or positively. So now if it's opening, it progresses the animation. If it's closing, it retracts the animation. And I think that's all we'll need for it to actually support the open and close animation. So let's try that now. And there we go, there's the animation. And now obviously we can't close because the background hasn't been injected yet. But we now have an actual animation. So you can see we click that and it animates. And importantly now we can check, and it should update live in this view. Let's see if we've actually fixed this view. We should just be able to bind to our property called open, and we should be able to set that to true. And if we do, this should in theory be visible here. So the previewer doesn't like our binding, which we could probably fix as well. Or the code in this case is wrong because it's animating in. So let's check what's wrong with that code, because if we've defaulted to open, then we expect that it should honor the first start bypassing that. So my suspicion is when we first get to this first start, it hasn't yet set the open flag. But let's just see if that's the case. So at this point, open is true. Oh no, it's not that then. So there's just something wrong with the code. So if we're open, we set it to 1 there. So now this is the part where we should be open. Ah, that's why. this won't be hitting this. Yeah, that's the problem. So if it is the first case here, we can, to be honest, we'll do, once it's finished, it stops and sets the final size. We'll do the same here directly. Because the first animation is completely different, we do want to stop the animation timer running, as well as setting, let's move that right to the top, actually just below that. We'll stop the animation timer running. I've put it in twice now. Get there in a minute. There we go. So clear the flag, we're not animating. Stop the timer from running. Set the opacity, set the full width to whichever we want, and do nothing. The problem was we were setting the opacity back, and on the next tick, we've never animated, so it was just then animating out. So it was close to what we wanted, but it wasn't what we wanted. So this should now open straight away, which I thought we tested that. Maybe I broke the code. Yeah, I think I probably just broke the code. So that's now working. But our UI doesn't like the logic to show open, and it should. So I'm not sure why that is. And it's probably to do with this, maybe. Because we know we saw differences when the render was called. And I'm going to make a guess. What can we do to check that nice and easily? How about we just say, regardless of that, just set the size and return, and always set it to desired size. Let's just do that and see if the UI updates correctly and shows the control. No, because the opacity is also not reset, obviously. So I'm just trying to find, by process of elimination, what the UI is doing to not work. So you can see it still doesn't work in this UI, even though we've told it to be set, which means animation tick isn't running. So if we were to tell the animation tick to run, that means that maybe this isn't firing, the render isn't firing, and that's why we saw different behavior. So let's set the, so well, let's just set the width and height to 100. Okay, let's just remove the opacity 0. Because without the opacity 0, if the timer wasn't running, we wouldn't be changing the size. Yes, there's the size, which now means this. See if this is running, which it must be, I'm sure. There you go, so render's running. Okay, this is a nice easy way to quickly test if it's working. If not size found, set that. So I presume this will work. And in which case, if it works, the callback, which was in here, let's just set the width here to, again, say 500. Height to 100 and return. And that's running. So we now know this timer's running. Yep. Let's prove the timer's running on an actual timer as well. So change that to, again, 2 seconds. And what we should see is this appear, and then 2 seconds later, change size. So that is definitely running. So the issue isn't with the property. The issue isn't with the timer running. Once the timer's running, let's just reset the opacity to 1 and re-enable opacity 0. Because I've got a feeling it's just something to do with the opacity. So in 2 seconds, does that appear? Yeah, so opacity is the problem. So we just left the opacity as what it should be for the moment. And then we let this continue to do what it would normally do and update the animation. The update animation will run. And I presume here again, let's just try 50 and 100. If that's the case, we also know the animation tick, yep, is running as we expect. So even this is running. If first animation, do this set, and let's just set that to 200 and that to 50 again. And if that works, I think we are just looking at some weird opacity glitch. Yeah, so that's running as well. So I think the entire code is running and working in the designer, but if we set the opacity, it fails. So in the designer, where we get this opacity and when we get this opacity, it is not correct. So there's probably a way to detect if we are in the designer, and there's probably another place to set this opacity. So perhaps and it's going to be hard to visually see, but perhaps the opacity can be set or remembered in a sense in the first render call. So the very first render, it might be too soon to see the control, it might be soon enough. But if we haven't found the size yet, we could potentially remember the opacity, and we don't care while we're remembering the size, or we do. You'd have to have another boolean, opacity captured equals true. Let's just give this a go. Private bool opacity captured equals false. Indicates if we have captured the opacity value yet. So by default we won't have, and then say if not opacity captured, on the first render capture the opacity and set the opacity to 0. I presume this would then work for the renderer maybe. And we could dig into the source code more to find out exactly where this sets, but I'm just experimenting at the moment. It's nice and easy to just trial. So let's see if this now magically appears. There we go. So the control now appears. Does the control appear here? Kind of flickers, but let's just see if that works. That's probably the 100 microsecond delay. Yeah, so it appears there. And it now appears here, which is what we wanted. And now if we change that to false, it should hide. If we change it to true, it reappears. It's kind of like flickery. Like it does a double flick, but I think that is literally this delay. So if we change that to a really small amount, I don't know whether this would still work because that's a really fast callback, but does it stop the flickering? Doesn't really stop the flickering, but it does show. So for now, it's I'd say other than this little visual flickery in the designer, which is only really when you're toggling between true and false on here, which I think is acceptable because it's a pop-up and you're not necessarily expecting it to be shown by default anyway. I'm going to say that's acceptable. We can probably improve that, and if you guys have any ideas of potentially why this is flickering like this, very likely to do with how we're doing the code. But for now, I'm okay with that. So we now have a way to bind to open and close. We can set on any control, bind to one of the commands we've exposed, so begin open and begin close will add to the background. So we could just set the YouTube one, if that doesn't overlay, which I think is covered. We could set this button up here, say just to close for now, just to show you. Will be channel configuration popup dot begin close. So just because we haven't got the background automatically injected at the minute, let's just show that the open and close work. So this opens slowly for 3 seconds. That should close, which it does. And one other thing we didn't check was the animation time. We didn't actually try and bind to that. So we should be able to bind now animation time and just do 0.3. You can see that flickering every time we're changing a value. So we'll probably improve that kind of visual there, but this should now change the animation time to 0.3, which it does. So all the bindings are working. We can now expose the kind of controls and properties we want here. And other than this slightly strange visual flicker when we change properties, doing that, which I'm sure we could get around with if we didn't have to wait for a render. But for now, for the visual, I've made the opacity work by moving this check into render. That's mainly just to make it work for the designer until we fix that better. But that's a huge step forward now to bind these controls nice and easy by just literally having animation time and whether you want to open and close, and then on buttons binding to a property. I think the last step for get this reusable on the second button is to now automatically inject this pop-up closer when an animation starts. So that's it for this one, guys. I hope you learned something. I'll catch you in the next.